welcome to SIIMcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine. Greetings, SIIMcasters. While system downtimes, whether planned or unplanned, are often a thorn in the side of the system administrator or IIP, they don't necessarily have to be. In this episode, hosts Mohanad and Prasanth sit down with Sylvia Devlin discussing the nuances of downtime procedures. Sylvia is not only the author of the chapter on downtime procedures in the second edition of Practical Imaging Informatics, but she is also one of the main editors of the book as a whole. She has extensive experience and insights on how best to plan for disasters, scripting responses, and communicating with end users in a clear and concise fashion. The discussion will also look at emerging concepts such as dealing with systems degradation, tools for maintaining and optimizing system uptime, and even looking at how these considerations can play a role during the RFP and purchase phases of an enterprise imaging deployment. We hope you enjoy.
Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started with communication during downtime. How do you balance the level of technical information to the end user with what they truly care about or really need to know, and things like the frequency of communication?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. Communication is key, and I've made the mistake of sending out downtime communications that contain a lot of technical jargon, thinking that my readers would get it. Something to the effect of, we're receiving TCP errors and the connection is refused and the queues are building up, the vendor has been contacted. And I would receive feedback later from radiologists that they had no idea what I was talking about. For those currently working, they're going to figure out pretty quickly that there's a downtime and the downtime communication is impacting them. But for those radiologists who are off-site or about to start their shift, they just want to know if it's going to impact their ability to work, right? So I would say the first part of the communications should state who or what end user type is going to be impacted by this. For example, users who use image sharing. We are getting reports that the image sharing platform is experiencing performance degradation and images are taking 20 minutes to upload to PACS. They'll know pretty quickly if that's going to impact them, right? And make sure that it's crafted in such a way that it describes the system, the issue, and the symptom. And then tell them what I'm doing about it, right? And keep those communications coming periodically until the issue has been fully resolved. And if at the end you can provide a root cause analysis, even better.
So communication is key, right? Just like you're talking about. Have you noticed one form of communication might work better than another? For example, like you were talking about email versus maybe the department has a website where everyone can go to and check to see green, red, yellow, and then more information, blah, blah, blah. What have you found? Is it better to do push notifications? Is it better to, have a dynamic web page? At least in your experience, obviously every system is going to be different, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a combination of all of the above. I think in some circumstances, email is good for some users. Others just want to pop on a dashboard and see, are we at red, yellow, or green, right? So that might be quicker for them, or going to a status page. So even in some extreme circumstances, you could use like a enterprise communication tool that will send a blast communication to all the desktops in the enterprise saying, we are experiencing X, and the user has to click the acknowledge button to state that they have read the message before they can continue working. So I think it just depends on the situation, what their environment is.
Speaking of the users, in the chapter, you talked about the importance of learning the end user workflow, i.e. putting yourself in your user's shoes. Do you want to comment a little bit more about that?
Oh, yes. It is really important for the imaging informatics team to have a firm grasp on the end user workflows. Whenever I'm composing downtime procedures, I take time during normal periods to learn the end user workflows. I actually learn a lot about a system when I see it through the lens of the end user, not just through the imaging informatics camera lens. It's really beneficial even outside of downtime procedures. But what about downtime procedures? When composing the downtime procedures, I will schedule meetings with a representative from each role, so technologist, radiologist, film librarian, et cetera, and ask them what they would do or how they would function if our system or systems were down, and how they would revert back to an analog workflow. This is easier for some of us more seasoned imaging team members that used to use paper requisitions, and dare I say, film. We know how to get through those periods of analog workflow. But some of the younger generation who have never worked with paper requisitions, it can be a bit mind-blowing for them. So taking the time to understand their workflows, both uptime and downtime workflows, is vital. When you have an unexpected downtime, guests will be calling and asking you what they're supposed to do, right? So being familiar with their workflows and the workarounds that you had some forethought on ahead of time and having it in your downtime procedures, it really makes the downtime go easier. You can tell them, oh, remember, you're supposed to do X, Y, and Z, and they'll be, oh, that's right. I remember that now. Also, I would document what the end users would do or what workarounds they would deploy if the systems were to go down. So have it right there in your downtime procedures. That way, the documentation is condensed and available in one spot. You're not having to go to multiple places to find, oh, their workflow is over here and their workflow is over there. So when there is a downtime and you're putting fires out, the last thing you want to be doing is searching through multiple documents. So really having it all condensed in one downtime procedure may seem a little redundant because some of the different roles may have similar workflows, but it really is a time saver when you have it all right there.
I can only imagine having to go back to film after so many years. I think the last time I saw film was 2007, I want to say. Hard copy film, chest x-ray, things like that would probably be fine. But people are really not used to reading like a CT or like a PE CT, anything like that. It's going to be rough if you're heading all the way back to film. Workflow-wise, yeah, you're right. Paper requisitions can be difficult, but I'm not sure how people are going to survive going back to the film age, if you will. I could imagine that part of this communication is, you've got your procedures and policies and whatnot, but maintaining a contact list, that's got to be tough, particularly if you're at a training institution, because people are rotating in, rotating out as they're coming in, they're graduating. You might have a visiting professor, and then you've got research people too. So I know George Shee, he had come up with his own internal phone book, and it was a Reddit style with voting up and down phone numbers or different contact information. So it was just kind of user generated. And then you could, actually find the people that you were looking for at the right number, because a lot of these phone books in the hospital may not be accurate. Thankfully, now with cell phone portability, we don't have to deal with changing phone numbers all the time. So that's pretty static this day and age. But still, there are a lot of other factors going on. What kind of strategies have you seen implemented, or what do you like for keeping these contact database or contact lists up to date?
Yeah, this is tough, especially in today's work market where many of us are changing roles within our organizations or even moving to other companies. So oftentimes you establish relationships with your vendors and organizational colleagues, and you get to the point where personal contact information is shared. But you can't always count on that, obviously. Vendors will occasionally reach out to me even after I've left the organization. And the first few times I heard from them, I thought, wow, that was really nice of them. But I began to realize, oh, I think I know what they're doing. They're checking on me to see where I landed, right? It's easy to lose track in such a mobile market, but imaging informatics is a small world. In fact, I recently changed jobs myself. And just the other day, I found myself on an email thread with a vendor engineer I worked with at my very first PACS admin gig over 13 years ago. So maintaining and upkeeping a contact list is important to do, though I am still seeking a good technique for this. So it'd be interesting to see George's tool in his toolbox for this. I did learn a valuable lesson, though, during an extensive downtime that I experienced. I wasn't able to get to any of my contacts on my laptop for several days. So now Speaking of cell phones, I store everyone's number on my cell phone. This works for the most part, but the risk you run into is that if they do leave the organization, they may not be the most appropriate person to reach out to anymore. I would also recommend storing contact numbers in the downtime procedures, maybe in the back in the appendix section. But bottom line, if you get contact information, hold on to it, even if you move to another organization, because chances are you will run into them again in the future.
So storing your contact information on your phone, that's fine. But one thing I've run into is sometimes techs will, whether it's downtime or not, they'll send me a message saying like, oh, this study is done, and then put patient information in. And here in the States, we have HIPAA. So what have you guys done, particularly around downtime, to help mitigate any sort of patient health information? Obviously, it's not being leaked with malicious intent, but people lose phones, things get hacked, blah, blah, blah. And as I tell people, I don't want to have some PHI on my phone and then suddenly I've got a $20,000 hit from CMS because they're going to come after you, right? So what kind of things might you think about for mitigating this kind of issue?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Completely discourage any kind of PHI being sent on the phone. I think that if they needed to give me the information, I would ask them to call me. I know that's not always ideal. But also, if they're able to use an internal chat like Teams is primarily what we use, and it's within the firewall, we should be fine communicating that way. You can even put Teams on your phone, so that information is on the cloud.
And that just reminded me of something I wanted to bring up. Not so much a question, but if I had $1 for every time I saw somebody with a phone that wasn't set to store contacts in the cloud, I'd probably be pretty rich. So just a pro tip for everybody that either you have your phone storing your contacts into the cloud so that when you switch, they're there, or make sure if you're paranoid about privacy and big tech reach into your life, taking constant backups of your phone. Now, I do want to ask another question about downtimes, Sylvia. So I know that can be very frustrating for the end users. Do you have any recommendations for the audience as far as customer service, communication during those times?
Yeah, communicate early, communicate often. Email is a good option for sending out regularly timed communications, like every 30 minutes, I think is what we send ours out as. But another option is using that masked desktop notification software that I spoke about earlier, where the message displays on the user's workstations, letting them know that we're having a problem. And like I said earlier, the users literally using that software technology, they have to click on the acknowledge button to make the notification go away so they can continue working. You want to make sure that you send a communication to your imaging directors, radiology chairs, and other senior leadership. This may require a text or a phone call directly to them. They really don't appreciate hearing about a downtime after the fact. So, that's part of customer service, right? They are indirectly our customers. So you want to make sure you keep them in the loop. When you communicate to your end users, I would try to be as transparent as possible. Your end users really appreciate that because, they're caring for patients and they need to know as much as you can tell them, because the bottom line for them is they want to know when they're going to be able to resume normal operations. I think I would also recommend having support team members go out to the floors if you can spare them and speak to the end users directly. The end users really appreciate seeing that support is there and engaged. I can't tell you how many times I've arrived at areas during a downtime and heard, "Oh, thank God you're here." So going to them provides you with the information that could help with the troubleshooting. So what I mean by this is that the on-site team members can go to where the users are and they can describe what they're seeing in real time and report it back to those who are actively working the problem and tell them what they're actually seeing. And what can happen in that communication between the team members that are working directly with the end users and those that are working the problem behind the scenes, they can make tweaks and we can tell them in real time if what they tweaked made the difference. So it's really valuable teamwork. I also want to include the communication with your vendors because after all, we are their customers. If you choose to communicate with your vendors over email during an unplanned downtime, it's fine up until a point. Asynchronous communication can get messy and confusing really quick. So a really good rule of thumb that I use is if one of us is getting hung up on a particular issue and it takes more than 3 emails to get it sorted out, it's time to jump on a call. So I would always be ready to fire up that virtual meeting app and deploy the invites.
That's awesome. It's really good information. How do you prepare your staff for expected or unexpected downtimes? Does everyone have a PACS admin t-shirt so that they can go out and they can, it's bright red and everyone knows, it's kind of like how we had the code hero for the hackathon t-shirts, right? Or like Best Buy employees always wear that same color, make people visible and available for help. Are there other more formal measures or training things that you might recommend or think about?
I like your idea about the shirts, but I can tell you that pretty quickly people know that you're support and they will recognize you immediately. So, but again, I'm not a big fan of email only for downtime communications. It is a tool that can be used for communication. In terms of preparing the imaging team and other specialties for unexpected downtimes, that's just one of those things that sounds good on paper, but execution can be really tricky. Because technologists, for instance, oftentimes they work PRN. Your radiologist can work off-site. So having one-on-one time with imaging team members for preparations isn't always doable. So, because downtime prep requires a multifaceted approach, I believe. So regarding formal measures for training, I think a lot of that depends on your setup. If your institution is academic or uses academic approaches, perhaps you provide weekly team meetings where you routinely provide educational in-services already. So that might be one way that you could regularly talk about downtimes, preparing for unexpected downtimes. If that's your gig, then that would be a perfect platform for formal measures of training. If you're in a smaller community hospital, chances are that you're going to know your end users, some of them pretty well. So therefore, the informal, on-the-fly, one-on-one training sessions are great because the training can be tailored to each learner, and it's a great way to network and build relationships. Circling back to using virtual options, with the advent of virtual meeting platforms, giving periodic in-services on these sorts of platforms, they can be recorded and viewed on demand. So, which is fantastic for some of your team members who work off hours or PRN. Business communication platforms allow you to create channels. We call ours downtime. So when we have a downtime, team members can hop on, and we have a scribe who is listening to the troubleshooting calls. What they'll do is they will provide updates in real time so that our end users can go to the channel and see what's going on, what we're working on, what we've discovered. That mitigates a lot of phone calls and provides our end users with real-time information. It allows us also to focus on troubleshooting and not pick up the phone. So additionally, you can store downtime documentation on that channel, so that documentation is readily available. Now, if you're experiencing a network outage or a power outage, then that option won't work, obviously. So I highly recommend having hard copies of your downtime procedures available. And not just downtime procedures, but your vendor contact information, site IDs, and configurations. And even having a hard copy of contacts, as well as your contracts with your vendors in case things really go sideways. And you need to see what your contract stipulates. You're not going to be able to access any of that information in soft copy format if you can't access anything on your network. So I guess to answer your question, it's all of the above.
Yeah, this can be a tough topic to go over because there are just so many different flavors of downtime, from just network, earthquake, hurricane. It's so variable, and we need to be ready for all sorts of different things. And here's a shameless plug for, the IIP program. One of the hospitals I had worked for in the past, they'd find some super tech or someone in IT to be the PACS administrator. But it wasn't until that they hired an IIP. And when I said, okay, disaster recovery, downtime, and they knew exactly what I was talking about, exactly what we needed to do. And they're like, yes, I've already reviewed it, I was like, oh God, thank you so much. Like those lines of communication were right there, ready to go. I've probably told this story on the podcast multiple times before, and it is a shameless plug for the IIP program because it was just so easy. And I was just like, okay, good. Now we can stop with the simple small fires and we can actually make progress on these really important other aspects that we need to think about for the department as a whole. So I'd like to kind of drill down a little bit more into this idea of different kinds of downtime, right? So a lot of the times we use it generically, the term downtime, it's like, okay, all the systems are down, right? Everything is down, cold, can't dictate, can't do anything. But that's not always the case. Just say, for example, all systems are up except speech recognition, or everything is up except you can't import DICOM because your node, that is out. You don't want to pull out the whole manual for full-on downtime. So should we start thinking more or consider like almost separate procedures for downtime of components? Almost have a decision tree matrix. Is this down? Is everything else up? Go to page 6. Choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'm composing downtime procedures right now, and I have all of our systems listed, and each system has its own downtime procedure protocols, because you're right, it's really uncommon for multiple systems to all go down at once, with the exception of a power outage or network outage. So the scenario you described is quite common, actually. So the reason you want to consider composing downtime procedures for particular components is that the measures taken for one system outage can be vastly different from that of another. So, for example, if PACS goes down, that would likely require the radiologist to get up and go to the modality to render a stat reading. Whereas if an imaging sharing platform goes down, it wouldn't necessarily have an impact on the radiologist, right? But would definitely impact users from the other specialties who depend on the use of the image sharing platform systems while seeing patients during their clinic, or using that system to view images while performing surgeries in the operating room. So composing downtime procedures for particular components during periods of normalcy allows for careful thought and considers the various end user workflows. Depending on the system, you would want to run your downtime procedures past your radiologists, your technologists, as well as the users from the other specialties like emergency medicine, cardiology, orthopedics, et cetera, to make sure that your downtime procedures and workarounds are solid from their perspective in order to provide that continuity of care that we seek when using downtime protocols and procedures. In addition to that, when I write my downtime procedures, I actually get even more granular as I describe what each role should be doing during that downtime. So I always start with the imaging informaticist. This is what we should be doing, right? Get that communication out, contact the vendors, get your subject matter experts on the phone, and I'll list contact information right there. Then I will go to the radiologist. What should they be doing? If Power Scribe is down, get your temp reports ready. You're going to have to use whatever workaround tool that we have set up for them, and so on and so forth. So you have it right there in front of you. And so when they do call or contact you, you could tell them right away, oh yeah, doctor, you should be doing X, Y, and Z for this. And right away, it'll do a memory jog for them. Oh yes, that's right. That's right.
So thankfully, unplanned downtimes are becoming less and less often, but we all know that downtime is not necessarily a black and white thing. Sometimes it's a system degradation, like maybe a system is becoming slow and maybe gradually slower, grinding to a halt. Do you feel like there might be a place for degradation procedures?
Oh, yes, the dreaded degradation and performance call. It's almost worse because the system can be running fine for one segment of your users while other users are reporting the system is practically unusable. So there's so many even variations of that. So I would say, yes, there is definitely a place for degradation procedures. And what that means exactly would depend on a few things. For instance, it would depend on the system. Is it a system that has a direct impact on the immediate care of our patients, such as risk, PACS, et cetera? Or is it a system that is important, but wouldn't jeopardize the patient throughput, such as, let's say, a peer review component? It's still important, but probably not as emergent as some of the other systems we support. It also depends on what type of practice in medical imaging we're talking about. And what I mean by that is, let's say if mammography studies are coming to the radiologist very slowly, yes, it's a total inconvenience and definitely needs to be addressed, but you've got time with mammography studies versus, say, a stroke case where time is of the essence. Also, if you are a level 1 trauma center and your systems are experiencing performance degradation, it's a whole heck of a lot different than if, say, an imaging center that only images outpatients. Obviously, the level 1 trauma center scenario, it would be advantageous to have a workaround process or degradation procedures ready to deploy when needed. And I'm sure your end users and patients would appreciate that forethought. Besides your applications experiencing degradation, there are other types of unplanned performance degradations that would be very difficult to foresee. For instance, if the data center where your servers live, if they experience issues with, say, the backbone circuits in a particular geographical area of the country are having problems, this is a situation that is completely out of your control. My point is that there are numerous degradation scenarios, meaning one could never anticipate them all. But when these one-offs do happen, it would be a good opportunity to document and keep them in something like a knowledge base so that they can be referenced at a future time. Because it could be some time before something like that would happen again. And by that time, who knows? Your current team may not be there anymore, and you have a completely whole different set of support team members.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to look at. And maybe that means in the version 3 of the book, you'll have 2 chapters to write, one on downtime and one on degradation procedures instead. Yeah. Hopefully that won't be for a while. I know you're very busy with everything else that you have going on. I had a question. We have all these ancillary programs, right? Here we have, for ultrasound, we have like this iMorgan for showing cine of ultrasound and this and that. Or we have a DICOM SR module on the ultrasound machine to send over, fetal biomorphic information, things like that, all sorts of other ancillary programs. And some of them have been around for a while, right? So they have a track record. But many of them are new, particularly some of these new AI, of course. AI has to come into the discussion at some point. With respect to fault tolerance, how do you factor these unknowns into the equation for the department? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it can be very challenging. And it would depend partly on what was decided upon when you negotiated and stood the system up. But even then, you can run into trouble. You may use a system where you work that is fairly new. And despite being new, it is so tremendously successful, meaning they're hot. Everybody wants to use them and their customer base is growing really quickly. But it's growing quicker than they can keep up. So what ends up happening is they don't have the storage to accommodate the load, or even worse, they don't have the resources to help you like they did when you first started. Not their fault, obviously, that they're so good that you and pretty much everyone else wants to use their product. But how would you know that when you sign the contract? Being a good faith partner with your vendors and working through the challenges together is key in this scenario to getting to successful outcomes faster. Of course, a respectful and productive communication with your vendor is equally important to achieving those successful outcomes. How to factor the scenarios such as this into the equation? I mean, you just got to work through it and try to be forward thinking to get ahead of it. It's a win for everyone when the technical folks on the vendor side can work with the technical folks on the customer side and collaborate on solutions on the fly. Oftentimes that happens. You're coming up with really solid workarounds. It's easy for me to say here on this podcast, easier said than done. I totally get it.
I'd like to change the topic into a slightly different direction here. And this is going to be an open-ended question, but Sylvia, feel free to get into as many little details as you want. When you fortify for things like high availability, business continuity, and or disaster recovery, these solutions can get very expensive and complicated to set up. What are your suggestions for things like how do you manage the scale, the scope, which ones of these do you prioritize? How deep do you go on these? Do you do this for every one of your systems? What organization is too small or too big to have one or not have one? Sorry, I'll leave it with you.
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest with you. This is probably my weakest area, scalability and high availability. I'd probably have to defer to my colleagues that are in the IT architecture realm. But, keeping up with what's available out there, technology is ever changing, right? And keeping up with going to your places like SIIM, where we have these annual meetings and you can speak with the vendors, see what's up and coming. Also, keeping the communication with your vendors. A lot of times they will be tracking your usage and they can make recommendations on storage. Again, communication with the vendor.
That's a good advice.
Yeah, it can be tough. I find since being somebody who's in informatics, everyone comes to me with all these questions. And I'm like, I have a very narrow set of areas that I know as much about, but I'm learning all the time about some of these things. And you're right, you can't keep up with every little aspect of it because just the IT networking infrastructure is changing constantly. Storage is changing constantly.
Yes.
RAID, we're up to like 10 or 20, whatever. I'm still like, okay, I understand RAID 1, I understand RAID 2, 5, 6. Yeah, okay, sort of. So unless you're in that field, it makes it tough. As we're wrapping things up, I do want to get your top tips and keeping your head about you and navigating through unplanned downtime that you might share with everybody.
Yeah, those are fun. In most of the organizations I've worked at, the imaging informatics team, as well as our database team, HL7 team, and networking team, we've all worked very well together. So what we have done, or what I am doing now, or referencing, because I did come into a new position here, is there was a major incident guide that was already created where it can list out the standard tasks that have to be performed during a system outage. So having that readily available kind of removes the need to recall the necessary tasks from memory and keeps you and your team on track. This is especially handy if you are the one responsible for leading the downtime call. So let's say you have an unexpected downtime, and what you could do is whip out this quick guide and walk through the steps. So number one, open a downtime conference call and have the link in the document ready to go so that you're not creating a whole new invite on the fly. Number two, send out a communication that states the issue. Number three, notify the on-call team members that should be a part of the call and the solution. Having the essential team members on the call is really effective. You're not communicating over email, which is really painful during unexpected downtime. Don't get me wrong, email is great for many things, but asynchronous communication during a downtime leads to a lot of miscommunications and frustrations, in my opinion. The advent of the virtual meeting tools such as Zoom, Ring Central, and Teams is fantastic for this because you share information in the chat. Team members can share their screens for troubleshooting. And anyone who has had the pleasure of a major downtime, which can go on for hours, so having everyone just hop on a virtual meeting is really helpful. But going back to the quick guide, you can include a checklist. I am big on checklists because it keeps me on track when my phone is blowing up and I'm getting pinged from multiple directions. Another thing I would consider is delegating a scribe. Where I work today, when we have a downtime, we have someone leading the downtime call, and then someone is delegated to scribing. They scribe the events of the call. The updates are then posted on our downtime Teams channel. The scribe can also open tickets and help with those sorts of tasks so that the call leader can continue guiding the call. It really is a teamwork approach.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sylvia. This has been really great to talk to you about this topic. And clearly we can go on for a long time, but alas, we should end here on this nice high note. Thanks again for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
SIIMcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.